Sputnik 1 was a turning point in history because it launched the world into the technology age and sparked the furious competition between the United States and the USSR that pushed the world into a frenzy of scientific and military advancements, while also introducing the current role of media. The story of Sputnik began in February of 1945 at the Yalta Conference. A temporary American alliance with the Soviets against Hitler and the Nazis turned into a fierce rivalry as the conflicting ideologies of the two major world powers clashed. Space was seen as the next frontier to the public, but the governments of the world saw the space age in a different light. Each country was suspicious of the other, mainly because of the new paranoia inspired by the atomic bomb. In July of 1955 at the Geneva Convention, President Eisenhower proposed the "open skies" that would allow nations to fly intelligence aircraft over any other country. The USSR rejected the proposal, and Eisenhower responded by saying that the US would launch a satellite. The USSR countered by saying that they would as well. In a memorandum from a July 1955 meeting of the National Security Council, it was determined that the intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, were to be given top priority, and that there would be the gravest repercussions should the USSR achieve an operational capability with the ICBM. The International Geophysical Year, IGY, a scientific extravaganza that lasted from the 15th of July 1957 through the 31st of December 1958, was when both the US and the USSR launched their satellites under the guise of scientific advancement. German scientist Wernher von Braun had an army team that could have launched a satellite at least 2 months before Sputnik, but President Eisenhower went with the Navy's Project Vanguard to represent the United States in the IGY instead. This decision by President Eisenhower may have inadvertently stopped a nuclear war. Because the Russians had launched a satellite first, by implication, they gave the US permission to put their own satellites in space. Had the US launched a satellite first, the Russians may have taken it as an act of war, and responded accordingly. On October 4, 1957, the news of Sputnik was announced at an IGY conference, and the scientists everywhere celebrated not a Soviet victory, but a human victory. However, this euphoria did not last long in the United States.
At first, Sputnik was not considered a major threat, or even an embarrassment to the US. A Gallup poll showed that only 50% of the population thought Sputnik damaged the American reputation at all, and only 13% thought that Sputnik meant America had fallen dangerously behind the Soviet Union. Top government officials, however, were quicker to brand Sputnik as a threat to American superiority. The result was the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, under President Eisenhower as a result of the Space Act passed by Congress in 1958, and the subsequent increases in NASA funding under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. The money given to NASA was used to fund private contractors in creating new equipment for the space race that was now in progress. This reaction by the government set the US population into somewhat of a panic, while in Russia things were dramatically different. The Russians portrayed the US as a magpie, in contrast with other countries who were nightingales. This propaganda was in response to US imperialism and democratic influences in other countries. So when Sputnik was launched, the Russian people celebrated a victory over a flawed elitist institution. Initially, the USSR was successful in defending its advantage, pursuing the Vostok and Soyuz programs after Sputnik. However, in 1966, the head of the Russian space program, Sergei Korolev, died, and the US pulled even. The USSR attempted to land astronauts on the moon with the development of the N-1 rocket, which ultimately failed in all of its unmanned tests. The USSR space program did develop the Soyuz spacecraft, which is still used today to get astronauts into orbit, more than can be said of any American space racecraft.
Before the launch of Sputnik, the US considered itself to be the world power as a result of the victory of World War II and the development of the atomic bomb a decade earlier. Thus, the Russian intentions of launching a satellite weren't taken seriously. Consequently, the space program in the US was immediately reinforced and received more support after the Russians launched Sputnik. This Soviet victory instigated the space race between the US and the USSR while also heightening tensions as the two competing world powers struggled for influence during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. In 1958, the US responded to Sputnik by launching their own satellite, Explorer 1. Newspapers reported that The United States must catch up with the Russian in rocketry quickly, or we're dead, unquote. The pride of the United States scientists had been wounded, and they now expressed a determination to catch up and overtake the Russian space program.
At first, the media did not display Sputnik as a threat in any way to America or her people. Citizens from all over the world gathered together where Sputnik would pass overhead, watching for a glimpse of the man-made moon. The New York Times said nothing of military matters, and even praised the Soviet scientists for, quote, approaching the launching of the satellite with modesty and caution, end quote. Then the euphoria of the great triumph for man wore off, and the media began to question Sputnik's impact on the United States' safety. Scarcely 6 weeks before, the Kremlin had announced its intercontinental missile that allowed them to direct rockets into any part of the world. The U.S. had discounted these remarks, but the launch of Sputnik made them take these words into deadly consideration. The Chicago Daily News expressed concern that, quote, the day is not far distant when the Russians can deliver a death-dealing warhead almost anywhere on the earth, end quote. Comparisons were drawn to Pearl Harbor, the first shots fired at Lexington, and to Columbus discovering America. The U.S. media and government had played Russia as a country that couldn't manufacture a dishwasher, much less a rocket, and the media was rubbing salt on an open wound. Once the implications of Sputnik set in, the public began to panic. Sputnik 2 was what the West needed in this war of propaganda. The Soviets were branded as monsters once the public realized that Soviet scientists had sent Laika, the lovable first astronaut, up with no intention of bringing her back. The media widely criticized the Russians for this, and it was a mistake by them in the media war. In December 1957, what should have been a reprieve for the U.S. turned into disaster as Voyager 1 crashed and burned mere seconds after liftoff. This was the opening scientist Wernher von Braun needed to convince the government and the public to fund his program, which successfully launched Explorer 1 on January 31, 1958.
There were several direct scientific advancements as a result of Sputnik. Sputnik 1 itself did not pick up much useful data, but Sputnik 2 monitored the life signs of the first living organism in space, while Explorer 1, the first U.S. satellite, discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. NASA, which was created as a direct result of Sputnik, has made some of the most prolific advancements in the scientific community, the most recent being Curiosity, the land rover NASA sent to Mars. However, Sputnik's long-term effects unearthed more scientific achievements than just those from its first few years. Most notably, satellite technologies have led to the cell phones, GPS systems, and other gadgets we take for granted. The International Space Station was built because Sputnik opened up space to the world. However, one of the most significant repercussions of Sputnik had nothing to do with science. In 1975, with the world watching, astronauts from the Russian Soyuz and American Apollo united their ships, and Colonel Leonov welcomed the Americans with a "glad to see you." This was the first step in moving away from the threat of a nuclear war, a step Sputnik had opened the door to 18 years before. The successful launch of the first satellite into space marked not only the beginning of the space race, but also the space age. The first fearful reaction of Americans at this time was that Russia may have had the capability to send ICBMs across the globe at will. Today, the United States and many other nations have ICBM capabilities, and the U.S. not only has the capability to send satellites into space now, but to send satellites for research and commercially for devices like cell phones and internet coverage. Sputnik and the beginning of the space race marked an entire new era of technology and the use of technology. The information age has come about at the turn of the 21st century as a result of the technology that was used in the launch of Sputnik. An achievement that shocked and astounded the world 60 years ago is now taken for granted, and technology that was once cutting edge is used widely across the globe. The after effects of this satellite are still present. NASA still exists as the official space organization of the United States and even collaborates internationally with several other nations, including Russia and Japan. The combined space programs create massive research satellites such as the ISS, and other projects such as landing the first probes on Mars that reach farther into the realm of space. Not only has the launch of Sputnik had a revolutionary impact on technology, but it has also endured as a lasting and meaningful metaphor. President Obama in his 2011 State of the Union said that the current condition of the United States was a Sputnik moment. This simple statement shows just how much Sputnik changed. Sputnik is now the classic example of a shock, something unexpected, something that changed the world.